What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the kitchen. Today we're glazing a pork tenderloin in a beer and teriyaki sauce, served over Parmesan mashed potatoes. Let's get into it. I've got a pork tenderloin here, and the first move is scoring the top in a crosshatch pattern before setting it on the plate. Those cuts open up more surface area for seasoning to grip onto, helping the glaze work down into the meat instead of just sitting on the surface once it hits the pan. Grinding some Himalayan salt onto the meat now. Working it across that scored surface we just cut into the top of the tenderloin. Cracking black pepper over that salt now. Building the second layer of seasoning right on top of it before anything else even goes on here. Sprinkling smoked paprika over the meat now, and I'm working it into the surface with my hand before flipping the whole tenderloin over to season the other side the exact same way we just did this one right here a minute ago. Grinding more Himalayan salt onto this second side now, matching what we put down on the first side a moment ago before this. Cracking black pepper over this side too, building up that same base of seasoning we already worked into the first side just a minute or two ago. Sprinkling smoked paprika over this side as well, rounding out the seasoning before the oil goes on next. Drizzling vegetable oil over the whole tenderloin now, and I'm using both hands to work it all the way into the meat, making sure it reaches every part of that crosshatch pattern we scored into the surface earlier on. That oil is what actually helps all these dry spices bind to the meat, instead of just sitting loose on top and falling off the second it hits a hot pan. Pouring vegetable oil into a pan now, getting it up to heat before the tenderloin goes anywhere near it at all, since a cold pan is the fastest way to a pale sear instead of a real proper crust on this seasoned meat we just prepped a minute ago. Adding butter into the pan next, letting it melt down completely across the whole surface before setting the tenderloin down into it to start searing on the very first side of the meat we just finished seasoning a minute ago on the counter. Cutting our potatoes now and adding them into a pot, getting them ready to boil down into the base of our mash later on tonight with everyone. Cutting these into roughly even pieces matters more than people think, since uneven chunks mean some potatoes turn to mush, while others are still firm by the time you pull the pot off the heat. And that inconsistency shows up in every single bite of the finished mash, once it's whipped together at the very end of all this cooking tonight for dinner. Bigger pieces also just take longer to boil through completely. So keeping the size consistent across the whole pot saves you from guessing when it's actually done and ready for the masher to take over from here. It also just makes the whole boiling process a lot more predictable from start to finish, which matters when you've got a tenderloin resting and timing to juggle at the same time. Adding 1 tablespoon of salt into the pot now, pouring in water right after it, then covering the whole thing with a lid to bring it up to a boil on the stove so the potatoes cook through completely and soften right up before we mash them all later on tonight for everyone's dinner together. Flipping the tenderloin over with kitchen tongs now that the first side has picked up some real color from the pan. After about 7 minutes, I'm pulling the tenderloin back out. Finally chopping onion now, since this is going in to build the base of our glaze in that same pan the pork was just searing in a minute ago on the stovetop over there on the counter next to us right now while it's still nice and hot. That leftover fond stuck to the bottom of the pan is loaded with flavor from the seared meat, and it's about to work its way into everything we build in there from this point forward. Starting with this onion right here, going in first, before anything else joins it in the pan with it a little later on down the line once it's all cooking together nicely in there on the heat. Adding that onion into the pan now, and I'm stirring it around with a kitchen spoon to get it moving in all that leftover oil and butter still sitting in there from searing the meat a few minutes ago on the stovetop right here on the counter next to us this whole time. Finely chopping celery now, adding some real depth to this glaze base that a lot of people wouldn't think to include in something that's headed towards sweet and sticky by the end of all this cooking, tonight for dinner, with everyone at the table together, with us all here at home tonight. Quick question for you while I work through this. What's the one vegetable you think gets overlooked the most in everyday cooking? The thing that deserves way more credit than it usually gets from most people sitting at the table together every single night? I'd love to hear your pick down in the comments below this video right now, while you're still watching this whole thing tonight with us all here. Adding that celery into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon so it starts softening down alongside the onion, already cooking away in there together on the stove, for a good while now with everything else building up in the pan alongside it, filling the whole kitchen with a really good smell already at this point in the cook tonight. Taking a red chili pepper now, slicing it lengthwise, pulling out the core and seeds, then chopping it down fine before it goes anywhere near the pan. First time I ever cooked with chilies like this, I skipped removing the seeds entirely because I didn't know any better back then. And the dish that came out of that mistake had way more heat than anyone at the table was actually asking for that night at dinner, with everyone gathered around together at home with us all that particular evening. Removing the core and seeds now is really the difference between a glaze with a gentle kick and one that overwhelms everything else we've built into it so far tonight, before it's even close to finished cooking here on the stove, for everybody sitting at the table waiting. Adding that chili into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon so it starts working its way into the onion and celery already cooking together in there on the stove right now, with the rest of everything else already sitting in there with it right now on the heat together this whole time we've been building this glaze. Finely chopping garlic now to go in with everything else already cooking in the pan. And if you're ever out of fresh garlic when a recipe like this calls for it, jarred minced garlic will get you through in a pinch, just without quite the same sharp bite fresh cloves bring to a glaze built around so many other bold flavors already stacked into it at this point in the cook. Tonight, for dinner with everyone. Fresh is always the better call here if you've got it on hand, but this isn't the kind of dish where jarred garlic ruins the whole thing either, so don't stress too much over which one you've got in the kitchen tonight. For this particular recipe we're working through together right now, adding that garlic into the pan now, and I'm stirring it through with a kitchen spoon. And that smell hitting you right now, garlic working its way into all that onion, celery, and chili, already cooking in leftover pork fat, is exactly the base this whole glaze is about to be built on from here forward tonight for everyone's dinner together at the table with us all tonight. Adding 1 teaspoon of Italian herbs into the pan now, right on top of everything cooking in there. Adding a teaspoon of smoked paprika into the pan too, building more depth before the wet ingredients go in. Adding 1 teaspoon of turmeric into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon until that whole mixture takes on a deep golden color from the spice working its way through everything cooking in the pan right now on the stove, with all the rest of it already sitting in there together with it, changing the whole look of the base. Adding 50 milliliters of soy sauce into the pan now, bringing salty backbone into this glaze before anything sweeter joins in. Adding 50 milliliters of teriyaki sauce into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon. And that combination of soy and teriyaki together is what gives this glaze its deep, almost lacquered color once everything's reduced all the way down and clinging to the meat later on tonight when it's finally ready to plate up and serve to everyone waiting patiently at the table for dinner tonight, together with us all here at home, tonight for sure. Adding 2 tablespoons of honey into the pan now, bringing the very first real hit of sweetness into this whole mixture we've been building. Adding 1 tablespoon of cane sugar into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon so it dissolves into everything else instead of sitting at the bottom and burning against the hot metal underneath it, as everything reduces down together into that sticky glaze we're building up right now for this whole dish we're making tonight for everyone at the table. Adding 250 milliliters of dark beer into the pan now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon. And that bitterness from the beer is what keeps this whole glaze from turning one-dimensionally sweet once it's reduced all the way down to something thick and glossy at the very end of this whole cook tonight for dinner. Placing the tenderloin back into the pan now, right into that glaze, and covering it with a lid to let it soak everything up on the first side. Taking the lid off, flipping the tenderloin so the other side soaks in glaze, then covering it back up. Taking the lid off the potatoes now, after draining out the water completely, and dropping in 2 cubes of butter to start building our mash. Grinding black pepper into the pot now, and I'm using a masher to work the potatoes down into a smooth, even mash, since chunks left behind at this stage only get harder to break down the more milk and cheese we add on top of them in a minute here on the stove. Getting most of the lumps out now with the masher alone saves a lot of extra work once the electric whisk comes into play toward the very end of all this mash making tonight for dinner. Adding 150 milliliters of milk into the pot now, stirring it through with a kitchen spoon to loosen up that mash and bring everything together into something a lot closer to smooth before the cheese even goes in behind it in just a minute or two from right now on the hot stove top over there on the counter next to it right now while everything's still warm. Grating 70 grams of Parmesan on a fine grater now and adding it straight into the pot, since Parmesan melted right into a hot mash, disappears completely instead of leaving behind stringy bits the way some other cheeses would if you tried the same thing with them. Quick question for you while I work this in. What's your go-to add-in for mashed potatoes? The one ingredient that makes yours different from everybody else's version at the table? Let me know down in the comments below. Chopping green onion now, the last real ingredient going into this mash before it gets whipped smooth in a minute here. Bringing a little sharp, fresh contrast against all that rich butter, milk, and cheese we've already worked into it up to this point in the cook. Tonight, for everyone waiting patiently at the table for their dinner to finally be ready to serve up to everybody sitting there and waiting for it right now. Together with us all tonight, for sure, without a doubt. Adding that green onion into the pot now. Stirring it through with a kitchen spoon so it's distributed all through the mash instead of sitting in clumps in one spot of the pot, with everything else already mixed in there together with it right now on the hot stovetop over there. Whipping the mash with an electric whisk now until it's completely smooth, working out every last lump left over from the masher before this whole thing is ready to plate up and serve alongside the meat we already sliced up a minute or two ago on the cutting board over there on the counter nearby us right now, while it's still nice and warm from resting there for a little bit before we plate it all up. Taking the lid off the pan now and pulling the tenderloin out onto parchment paper, letting it rest a minute before slicing. Slicing the tenderloin into rings now, and each one showing off that dark, glossy glaze, wrapped clean around the outside. Exactly what all that reducing in the pan was working toward this whole time we've been building it up. First time I made a glaze like this, I sliced the meat way too soon after pulling it from the pan, and all that juice just ran straight out onto the cutting board instead of staying locked inside where it actually belongs once it's rested properly for a few minutes. Placing an elongated mound of that mash onto a plate now, shaping it into a long shape to match the tenderloin that's about to sit right next to it. Setting 5 rings of that glazed meat right alongside the mash now on the plate we just built. Pouring some of that glaze over the meat now, finishing it off with everything that reduced down in the pan. Finally chopping parsley now, the last touch before this whole plate is ready to go out. Since fresh herbs added right at the very end keep their color and brightness instead of wilting into the glaze if they'd gone in any earlier, while everything was still cooking away on the stove for the last hour or so tonight before dinner was finally ready to serve to everybody sitting there waiting at the table for it. Sprinkling that parsley over the meat now, and there it is, the money shot, the bite. Pork, glaze, Parmesan mash, coming together in one plate. That's a wrap for today. Hit subscribe. Catch you next time.